Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. My name is L. Lauren, and I am the author of the story you're about to listen to. Before I get into the book this week, I want to let you know that I did release another story over on my paranormal romance and urban fantasy channel. It's a light and fluffy short story installment, and it's part of the Wolf Who Saved series. Anyway, this week's story is titled Blaize. It is the second book in the Cockpit Club series, and it does contain recurring characters from book 1. Unfortunately, this is the last completed book of this series, even though I do have book 3 partially finished. This book was very fun to write. Again, this is when I felt like I got the hang of writing shorter works, and I was truly enjoying the process. The tropes in this one are forced proximity, hate to love, opposites attract, different cultures, or rather, like, it's intercultural alongside interracial. So we'll call it that, like, kind of different cultures, whatever. With all that being said, I'm going to let you guys get into the story now. Cheers. Oh yeah, the tractor is not fixed yet, so I know what my weekend plans are.
Blaize. The Cockpit Club, Book 2. L. Lauren. Chapter 1. Blaize. Thanks, Blaize murmured as he pocketed his credit card, folding a large paper receipt and twirling the hotel room keycard in his fingers. Can I get some help with my bags? The receptionist winced and flicked his tired eyes around the lobby. I'm afraid all of our extra employees are busy this weekend. There is a major modeling shoot. If you are not a model, a photographer, or a designer, then you have to carry your bags yourself. Excuse me, what? My sincerest apologies. Blaize's eyes bugged. I stay here every other weekend, and you can't spare one little bag boy to help me take my stuff upstairs. And we appreciate your business, but unfortunately. Yeah, I heard you the first time. Thanks. Blaize grumbled, shoving the keycard in the pocket of his hooded sweatshirt as he shouldered a duffel bag and wheeled a suitcase towards the elevators. He even had a favorite room, but this receptionist was clearly new and didn't know just how frequently Blaize booked with them. New or not, though, he should have been fired. Blaize raked his fingers through his short-cropped hair and pressed the elevator button, leaning against his suitcase. He couldn't deny that the place was bustling with business like never before. He had routinely picked this particular hotel because it was the city's best-kept secret. It had quaint, cozy rooms, an amazing view over a huge lake, and the best poolside service. The Cabana boys were beautiful. And the girls weren't bad either. Blaize carried his bags down the hall once he reached the 3rd floor, dumping them in the room with a gusty sigh. At least they still had the box of luxury dark chocolate on the pillow. Blaize's suite was nice too. Because he'd probably make more than $2,000 this weekend, it's nothing to spend close to $1,000 on accommodations, right? He needed to be comfortable, as he snoozed through the daylight hours and danced until sunrise. And by the looks of the room, he was definitely going to be comfortable. The room was so cozy that he couldn't even hear all the commotion beyond the suite's entrance. He kicked off his shoes and ripped his hooded sweatshirt off at the door, hanging it in the first closet. He hadn't worn anything under the sweatshirt because it was summer, and he was traveling. It was entirely too hot to saddle up with layers, and the room's cool air felt heavenly against his bare skin. It sent goosebumps down his spine as he snatched the box of chocolate from the bed and ripped it open. At the first bite, he groaned, spun on his toes, and flopped across the bed, rustling the tightly tucked white sheets and hanging his head off the side. Upside down, he peered through the sliding screen doors at the scenic lake and mountain backdrop, suited better for postcards than the city. He took another bite of the chocolate, letting it melt on his tongue and slide down his throat. Gravity wasn't stopping him from some of the best chocolate in the world. However, something else was. And that something barged right into Blaize's suite, carrying laughter and a thick Spanish accent with him. Blaize bolted upright and flicked brown eyes to the door, fixing them on the entrance as goosebumps crawled over his skin. Maria Sofia, Lanka, I will be down just shortly. Let me put my bags in my room, and then I will join the 3 most beautiful models at the swimming pool, the man said. He hung in the doorway with his hips cocked to one side and his shoulders pointing the opposite way. He had a mass of dark curls, peaks of bronze skin, and an accent that made the three women in front of him swoon. Blaize wasn't swooning. Actually, he was seething. "This isn't your room," Blaize snapped. "Ah," he started, cooing after the ladies giggled replies. Then he turned around, and Blaize sucked in his breath. His face was far nicer than his accent, with prominent features, soulful dark eyes, and a boyish smile that lit up his face. Blaize scowled more. "Not your room." The man sat a black bag down next to Blaize's bags and tugged a folded piece of paper out of his back pocket, reviewing it. "This is room 407, isn't it?" "Yes." Blaize snatched the paper from the stranger's hands and reviewed it. "This is impossible. This is my room." "I am confident it is a small mistake," the man crooned. He looked back at the women and shrugged at them. "I will meet you ladies downstairs as soon as I get this sorted." He winked. Blaize rolled his eyes. "Okay, sexy," one of the trio replied, running a hand down his arm as she spoke. She twisted her hips in a seductive sway, pulling his gaze downward. He exhaled in a husky chuckle, bid them goodbye again, and closed the door behind them, turning his attention back to Blaize. "Yes, we will get this sorted," Blaize confirmed. "We're going to the front desk right now." He threw the man's paper back at him and dunked his feet into his shoes, tugging a shirt over his head as well. "Ah, you look lovely the other way," the man teased. "I was hoping to enjoy the view for a little while longer." "No," Blaize snapped. "You have Santa Maria and Princess Wiggly hips to occupy your eyeballs. And what if I found a more appealing view?" "Too bad then. Because I'm not interested." Blaize breezed past him, pausing as he got a nose full of rich, exotic cologne before he continued out of the room, marching to the elevator. Chapter 2. Antonio. He adjusted the front of his slacks as the other man passed him, nostrils flaring as the scent of vanilla and musk touched his nose. The man had one of those colognes that mingled with natural pheromones, a cologne designed to drive everyone else on the planet crazy. Antonio was a part of everyone, so much so that he had already forgotten about his poolside promise. He had more interesting things to do, such as get to know this stubborn, fiery, and mysterious stranger. He collected his receipt from the ground and followed the sexy stranger out of the room, closing the door behind him. He met the other man at the elevator. "Oh great. Can I at least get your name?" Antonio smiled. It was hard not to. The little stranger was hot with anger, and it made his cheeks flushed and his eyes sparkly. "Sure, whatever, since in 10 minutes we will never see each other again. My name is Blaize." "Blaize. A lovely name." "I'm not one of your little girlfriends," Blaize hissed. "I don't need your empty compliments with your stupid sly smile." "Apologies. My name is Antonio." "I don't care." Blaize tilted his head to the side and rolled his eyes before fixing them on Antonio. "It is not my fault for the mistake, you know." "Does it matter whose fault it is? The point is you and all of your models and designers and whatever are absolutely destroying my weekend, and I'd like it if you went away." "We are destroying your weekend." "How so?" Antonio's eyebrows lifted. Blaize shook his head as the elevator dinged on the first floor. He stormed out of it and right up to the front desk, hands balled into fists at his sides, and a hurricane of anger spiraled off him. He snapped at the tired worker, and the worker peered at the computer. The exchange was heated, but Antonio couldn't make out the words. He, almost reluctantly, advanced closer. "I come here every other week, and I feel like I should be able to have a room without being mistakenly overbooked with Mr. Sexy Spanish over here." "I am not Spanish," Antonio corrected. "Well, you have a Spanish accent." "No." "Well, you know what? It's beside the point. The point is you're in my room, and you have to go." Antonio chuckled, slipping his hands in his pockets as he watched Blaize. The man was exceptionally beautiful, with high cheekbones, passionate eyes, and flushed cheeks. "I would be happy to move rooms," he said finally, tearing his eyes away from Blaize and looking at the receptionist. They had been yammering around him, but he had gotten enamored with Blaize's natural beauty. As I already told your friend. Oh, Blaize cut in. We're absolutely not friends. I have never met this stuck-up man in my life. The receptionist paused, batting long eyelashes at Blaize before looking at Antonio. As I have already stated, the hotel is fully booked. Fully booked? Antonio lifted his eyebrows. Yes, sir. Yeah, which means you don't have a place to stay tonight. Maybe one of Christopher Columbus's 3 ships will let you crash with them. Or maybe you'll get a first-rate tour of all 3. Antonio chuckled, closing his eyes and letting his eyelashes kiss the apples of his cheeks before he opened them again. This is a problem, he murmured. Actually, sir, the receptionist spoke again, directing his attention to Blaize. Mr. Silva's employer booked the hotel months in advance for their summer swimwear photo shoot. Okay, and? You will have to vacate the room. Excuse me? I paid for the room, Blaize hissed. I book this room all the time. The man's exasperation hit its breaking point, and tears welled at the corners of his eyes. We can refund your money, sir. That's fine, Defeat zapped away his anger, and his eyes darted around the room. He swiped his face with his forearm and sucked back a round of tears. You win, I guess, he snapped towards Antonio. Antonio chewed his bottom lip, eyes darting all over Blaize's impressive features. He could have been mistaken for one of the models in their shoot. In fact, Antonio wished he would be. At this moment, he wished he had his camera. Blaize's raw emotion was so strong and so moving. The pink around his eyes and the way his long eyelashes framed bedroom eyes inspired him. He cleared his throat. This room is very important to you. It's nothing. You really wouldn't understand. Blaize shook his head. Antonio nodded. Well, it is a rather large room. He looked back at the receptionist. I believe the couch is a bed too, isn't it? The receptionist had gone back to his task, but he looked up when Antonio regarded him, plastering a quick smile on his face. Ah, yes, sir. The couch folds out to a king-size bed. Perfect. Then, I guess I see no problem here. Antonio looked at Blaize. Would you like to go up to our room? Blaize blinked. Excuse me? What are you playing at? Nothing. I will be busy for the majority of the weekend, so you will have the room to yourself. I believe we both can enjoy our weekend here. I don't want your triplets in the room, ever. They will not be, I assure you. Antonio chuckled. Or any other women. If you're going to spend every night in between someone's legs, I don't want to see it. Blaize puffed out his chest. That would be incredibly impolite, Antonio laughed again. Do you have any more requirements of me? Yes, actually, I do. What is it? Antonio implored. Stop talking, Blaize hissed, stepping around him and breezing through the carpeted lobby back to the elevator. Antonio couldn't resist another husky chuckle as he followed Blaize back up to their room. It was barely afternoon, and the sun beaming in through the glass French windows bathed the room in a balmy heat. While they had been downstairs, Antonio's bags and equipment had been delivered to the room, and Blaize's belongings had been kicked out of the way. Blaize scowled even more, and frown lines set deep into his face as he collected his clothes and bags and moved them away from the heavy photography equipment. So, you're a real photographer then? Blaize prompted. I thought I couldn't speak. Antonio looked through his equipment, checking each box for damage before setting it aside. You can now, I guess. I am a professional photographer, yes. I am surprised you're not one of the models. You are exceptionally beautiful. Flattery will get you nowhere. I'm definitely not interested. I wasn't flattering. I do have plenty of shooting lined up, but if you have a spare minute, I would love to have you in front of my lens. Is that a photographer pickup line? Did it work? Antonio grinned. No, not at all. Blaize wrinkled his nose. Don't you have to meet your friends at the pool? I said I would meet them, but I would rather get to know my new weekend roommate. Not a chance. You should go meet your friends because your new weekend roommate is about to take a nap. To add truth to his words, he peeled his shirt over his head again, exposing tawny skin, and dropped his joggers next. Antonio's lips curled away from his teeth as Blaize's bottoms fell to the ground. He had briefs underneath, but the slow, languid reveal sent a shiver down Antonio's spine. Blaize moved into the bed with a natural grace, stretching out on it, before glancing behind him at Antonio. He lifted his eyebrows in a questioning look. Apologies. Antonio scrubbed his cheeks. I have a shoot this afternoon, but otherwise I should be out of your way. Thanks. Blaize nodded. And also, thanks for letting me stay here. It means a lot. Antonio smiled. You're welcome. He pocketed his keycard and slipped out of the room, closing the door with a gentle click. Chapter 3. Blaize. When the photographer left, Blaize closed his eyes, falling into a deep and necessary sleep, in preparation for his night ahead. He didn't like dancing all that much. Or well, he loved the act of dancing, but he could do without men grabbing at his ass and thinking they own him after giving him a 20. Most definitely not. But the money was good, and it had been a solid escape plan from his life. It had been more than a solid escape plan, actually. He had gotten away, and he never had to look back, and that was more than enough. He woke up when his alarm blared and knuckled his eyes. Dusk had fallen, and the room had cooled easily by 10 degrees. Goosebumps snaked up his skin as he threw the covers back and pressed his feet into the Berber carpeted floor, tiptoeing into the bathroom and slipping into the luxury shower. Work was better when he pampered himself a little bit first. If he started out feeling put together, it was a little easier to accept the criticisms that came with being naked in front of men, undeserving of the majority of the money to their name. He emerged from the shower with a towel wrapped around his waist, right as the photographer returned from wherever he had been. Laughter preceded him as the room door swung open, and he backed his way inside. His companions didn't linger, and he swung the door closed before turning around, freezing when he laid eyes on Blaize's still damp form. I trust you had a good nap. The best, Blaize murmured, now hating the hotel room's open floor plan. The photographer returned with shouldered black bags that he eased down onto the ground, and a flashy-looking camera that hung around his neck like the heaviest of necklaces. He lifted it and peered at Blaize. I'm not a model. Yes, but you might be my muse. Oh my God. Does that work on anyone? It works sometimes, but I am not kidding. Antonio smiled even as he lifted the strap from around his muscled neck, placing the camera on a side table before sitting down and disassembling it. You're not kidding. Blaize stepped away from his line of view and toweled off his body. I'm not. You're very inspiring. Inspiring? Oh, I get your cock hard, is that what you're saying? Antonio didn't respond. That is what you're saying. Blaize gave a hollow laugh as he dug through his dancer bag, digging out a flashy jockstrap and easing it onto his form, tucking himself away before turning around again. Antonio was still watching him. Okay, I'd tell you to take a picture, but it clearly seems like you want to. I'm an exotic dancer, and my shift is starting in an hour. If you want more than a look, you can come spend as much money as you'd like at the club. There's never going to be a free show. I never said I was expecting a free show, but every man who lays eyes on you tonight is a man I am jealous of. Are all photographers cheesy? Blaize recovered a fresh pair of joggers and a slim-fitting t-shirt from his bag next. The man's warm laughter filled the room. I suppose when they are attracted to someone they most certainly can't have, they might be. Good, you know, I'm unavailable. Blaize stepped into his joggers, his sneakers, and tugged the shirt over his head. Truly my loss. I hope you have a good evening at work. Thanks, Blaize grumbled, yanking a faulty zipper closed and throwing his duffel bag over his shoulder. Would you like for me to carry that downstairs for you? Are you trying to rack up favors to cash them in for the future, or are you doing a selfless good deed? Blaize stopped in front of Antonio. His t-shirt bunched at the side, and his joggers pulled down, revealing his smooth hip to the other man's scrutinizing eyes. Antonio's attention fixed on that sliver of skin, and he leaned back in his seat. The man's nostrils flared, and there was an unmistakable hardness in his jeans. Blaize grinned. Perhaps it was nice to be able to so easily distract a man with a sexy accent, bulging muscles, and the ability to get anyone he wanted. Well, he prompted. A selfless good deed. Good. Blaize dropped his bag at Antonio's feet, trading the straps for his cell phone and calling a taxicab. He led Antonio to the entrance, and they waited quietly together at the edge of the hotel's sidewalk until a yellow taxicab met them. Blaize climbed into the back seat, and Antonio tucked his bag in after him. Please, have a pleasant evening. Sure. Blaize closed the door and played on his cell phone all the way to the club. He had been dancing for 2 full years, but his nerves still spiked every night before he started his shift. There was something about working for a gay gentleman's club that sent his heart racing. Some days his heart raced in a good way. Other days it raced in a bad way, but he was never unaffected by his job. Either way, Thursday went without a hitch. He danced alongside some of his favorite dancers, and they worked together. His almost twin, a dancer named Adam, suggested a few clients to him while hooking a man for an upstairs dance. A few people left early because the night was slow, but it picked up, and by the time he left, he pocketed over $1,000 in profits. He returned to the hotel room in the wee hours of the morning, tossing his bag in the door and beelining for the shower. He washed off the booze, the smell of cigarette smoke clinging to his hair, and the feel of strangers' hands all over his body. The steamy shower water soothed him, and he wandered to the huge hotel bed afterwards, burrowing nude into the sheets and falling into a deep sleep. He burrowed deeper into the sheets when the sun crept into the room, turning his back to the window, but eventually, the sweet smell of syrup and the savory smell of breakfast meats drew him out of the mass of blankets. When he uncovered his face, he spotted the photographer over the hotel room's little kitchen, shirtless and gripping a stainless steel pan. "What are you doing?" Blaize groaned. "I made you breakfast. How about you come join me?" Chapter 4. Antonio. He spun around to face the sleepy man, sucking in his breath when he saw bare skin. The effect Blaize had on him was embarrassing. "I made you breakfast," he breathed. "How about you come join me?" Blaize stretched his arms over his head and raked his fingers through his hair, scratching his head. "What did you make?" "An American breakfast for you. I figured you would like it." Antonio tipped the pan forward, revealing scrambled eggs in one pan. The next contained split sausages. He had pancakes resting on a plate, already drizzled with honey, berries, and powdered sugar. "You figured I would like breakfast. You arrived so late last night. I couldn't imagine you had eaten a substantial dinner. So now you care about my well-being." Antonio shrugged and smiled. "I would like it if you joined me for a meal. We could talk." "Yeah, I just bet we could." Blaize threw the fluffy comforter and sheets back, revealing his completely naked form, and Antonio sucked in another deep breath. "My God," he stammered, eyes bugging. "You act like you've never seen a naked man before." "Besides myself. It has been a while, and the last man I saw naked does not compare to you." "Lucky me." Blaize quickly covered his bare skin with a sweatshirt. "The food smells good." "Thank you." Antonio turned back to the stove. "How was your night?" "Long, sweaty, boring." Blaize's gazelle legs carried him into the kitchen, and Antonio cut his eyes towards him, drinking in his graceful form as he moved. The DJ was good, so the music, at least, wasn't the worst I've ever heard. Small victories, I suppose. Antonio piled Blaize's plate with food and presented it to him once he had gotten a glass of water and sat down at the little breakfast table. "You know it's not even morning anymore." "Oh, I know." "Then why are you making breakfast food?" "Everyone appreciates breakfast food." He prepared himself a plate too, and sat down across from Blaize, slicing his pancakes idly. "I guess. Are you just getting up?" Blaize sat back on his seat, crossing his arms over his chest and narrowing his beautiful brown eyes at Antonio. Not at all. I have been up since sunrise. There was a photography shoot this morning. We started outside, and then we moved inside once the sun was too high over us. Oh right. Sexy photographer surrounded by sexy, half-dressed bikini models. My, how hard your job is. Antonio chuckled. Tell me about it. The long hours, the boring, tedious work. My models are disappointed. Why? I am usually so invested in the shoots, but this time I couldn't take my mind off of you. Oh right. There you go again with the cheesy flattery. If I just give you a photo shoot, would you be satisfied? Do you want to do it now? Blaize pushed away from the table and grabbed the hems of his sweatshirt. Antonio caught his breath, dropping his fork onto his plate. It is not flattery. He sat back in his seat as the crotch of his pants tightened and his eyelids fluttered. I could get my camera. Seriously? Yes. I don't have another shoot until this afternoon, and this room has enough light for an amazing indoor shoot. Blaize eyed him. You know what? Fine, artist boy, get your camera. Antonio exhaled a slow breath and quickly abandoned his breakfast. The idea of having his lens on Blaize was much more exciting than a plate of eggs and pancakes. He grabbed his camera, adjusted the lenses and memory cards, and then slung the strap around his neck as Blaize paced the area. What do you want me to do? I want you to be natural. I want to capture you, nothing more or less. Blaize rolled his eyes. If I were being natural, then I'd flip you off right now and walk out. Do it then. Antonio smiled behind the lens. Through it, Blaize was the most gorgeous creature he had ever seen, and he adjusted the f-stop until the only thing in focus was the stunning man in front of him. Whatever, Blaize scoffed. Antonio snapped a photograph. He snapped several more as Blaize's hard exterior dropped for a few seconds. Blaize's rawness was short-lived though. He quickly put his mask back on and turned up the charm, slinking over to the bed and stretching across it. Blaize knew his body and how to move. He was more graceful than some of the twiggy models he had shot all morning, and the way he looked at the camera sent Antonio's pulse racing. You're wonderful, Antonio murmured his encouragement, but his finger didn't stop mashing the shutter until hours had passed. The sun had changed positions and his memory card was full. Blaize had relaxed into the shoot, and they had communicated wordlessly. Photographer and muse, they had created beautiful art together, performing an intimate dance only they understood. Would you like to continue? Antonio asked as he scanned through the pictures. His cock flexed in the trap of his slacks, reminding him exactly how much he liked Blaize. I thought you said you had a photo shoot this evening? I do, but I have another hour at least until I have to report for duty. Well, spend that hour relaxing, not shooting me. Antonio smiled. And what if I'm enjoying shooting you? Blaize shrugged. He peeled himself off the bed as his cell phone chimed on the counter. He picked it up, swiped the screen, and reviewed the message. His face fell as he read. Antonio's smile faded too. What is it? It's nothing. The color drained from his face. It's just that the club received a bomb threat today, and my boss wants to know if I'm going to come in or not. Are you? I was thinking about it. I mean, we get threats like this all the time because it's a gay club. Blaize rolled his eyes, but the color hadn't returned to his skin yet. Don't go. I'm okay, he knit his eyebrows together. Why not? Because, Antonio thumbed the straps of his camera, I'd like to take you out instead. Blaize stared at him. You want me to miss work, so you can take me out on a date all of the sudden? Yes? Antonio nodded, nostrils flaring. Yeah, he drawled. How about no? I'm going to work. I need to make money this weekend, and it's probably nothing anyway. Antonio's hands trembled, but he gripped the plastic ridges of his digital camera. His eyes closed, and he heard screaming in the back of his mind. His eyes shot open again. His lips trembled too. Please don't go. Oh good Lord, Blaize groaned. I won't go, but you're paying for this outing, and you're telling me what the big deal is, too. Sure. A wave of relief washed over Antonio. He would have agreed to anything at that moment. He chewed his bottom lip. How about we go samba dancing? Salsa dancing? No, Antonio laughed. I'm Brazilian. They don't salsa in Brazil. Blaize blinked. They do, but we like the samba better. Antonio winked. And we don't speak Spanish either. We speak Portuguese. Now Blaize's cheeks flooded with color. Oops. Sorry about yesterday then. It's okay. I do have my shoot though, but I will try to return as fast as possible, unless you want to join me on the set. I'll wait here. I don't want to be some photographer's tag-along butt buddy. I also don't want to watch all the women throw themselves at you. Fair enough, though I could tell them to stop. Blaize plastered on a tense smirk. I'd rather just stay here. Antonio nodded. Then I will make the shoot quick. I will be back here to take you out as soon as possible. Sure. Blaize collapsed back into the bed with a long sigh.
I hope you are enjoying this story so far. If you are, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Thank you so much for giving this story a listen.
Chapter 5. Blaize. The photo shoot took place at the hotel's pool, and Blaize watched the whole thing from the comfort of his room. Frustrations grew inside him as he watched the models parade around Antonio, touching and squeezing his shoulders, hugging him, arching their sloping backs and jiggling their taut asses. Antonio had been true to his word though, and even though Blaize had elected to stay in the room, he still turned away the almost constant advances, and he spent no extra time chatting with the models. He got their shots and moved on. Within 2 hours of starting the photo shoot, the perfect sunlight had dipped behind the trees, leaving a cool blue cast on everyone lingering by the pool, and Antonio was finished. As he retreated from the poolside, Blaize jumped back into bed and fixed his eyes on the door until Antonio stepped through it. Then he averted his gaze, digging around for his cell phone as Antonio put his equipment away. First, he disassembled the lens from the body of the camera. Then he tucked it in a hard-sided case and stashed it in the front closet. When Blaize recovered his cell phone, his eyes trailed back to Antonio. How was your shoot? It was all right. It would have been better with your company. Sure. Blaize rolled his eyes. So it's samba date time? Samba and dinner. I found a nice place for us to go too, but if you don't mind, I would like a shower before we go. Sure. No problem. I need to get dressed anyway. Blaize's heart jumped into his throat, and he tracked Antonio to the bathroom, chewing his lip as the man disappeared inside. This date was really happening. They were really going somewhere together. He could count on one hand the number of times he had been on a date. Most guys, or at least the ones he had talked to in the last few years, didn't date anymore. There was talking, hooking up, and relationships, and the latter, you fell into after a certain amount of talking. Antonio's formalities stirred Blaize's emotions. There had always been an initial attraction, but initial attraction meant nothing. It was the follow-through and the compliments that had Blaize's blood rushing through his body, pooling between his hips at the possibilities after this samba dance night. He could see the blazing passion in Antonio's eyes. The man didn't bother hiding any of it. Blaize saw the way the photographer looked at him, with or without a camera to hide his hunger. The photographer wanted to devour him. And Blaize hadn't fully decided yet, but he was pretty sure he wanted to be devoured. The shower water ended, and Antonio emerged from the bathroom with one towel around his slim hips and another scrubbing his head, drying damp hair as the rest of him stayed soaked. Water droplets rolled over his bronze shoulders, down his hard pectorals and rippling abdominals. Curls of dark hair trapped the droplets of water just before they reached the fluffy white fibers of the towel. Let me get dressed. Sure, Blaize squeaked, losing any other words he might have said as the man turned and padded towards his suitcase, leaving damp footprints in his wake. Blaize's heart hammered against his rib cage as Antonio squatted in front of his suitcase and the towel gapped, showing a peek of his firm ass as he dug around for clothes. I should change too, yeah. Blaize stumbled out of bed, shaky legs abandoning him right as he put weight on them. He caught himself, flattening his palm against the wall. Antonio finally recovered a pair of jeans, boxers, and a collared shirt. He discarded the towel on his bottom half, and Blaize gasped. Is everything all right? Antonio glanced over his shoulder, meeting Blaize's wide eyes with a concerned look. His muscles rippled as his body twisted, and neglected water droplets on his shoulders glistened under bright white lights. More distracting, however, were his balls hanging between his thighs as his firm ass cheeks slightly parted from his crouched position. His hole was almost visible, hidden by shadows and a trail of dark hairs. Everything is fine. Ah. Antonio chuckled and stood to his full height, putting his heels together as he snatched his towel again and slapped it over his shoulders. His ass dimpled. I thought you were getting dressed. I am, Blaize snapped back, finding his old fire even when all of the blood in his body had rushed to his cock. Antonio's easy confidence excited him more than the naked body in front of him. The man's ever-present smirk matched with kind hazel eyes was enough to send Blaize reeling. His mind conjured thoughts of Antonio between his legs, that smile against the hard ridge of his cock, lips brushing over his balls. I can tell. Antonio stepped into his briefs, covering his toned ass, and carelessly folding and tucking away his manhood. Blaize wet his lips, slumping in front of his bag and digging through it. His legs were treacherous and his cock even more so. It throbbed against his lounge pants as he fished a pair of jeans and a casual t-shirt out of his bag. He had mostly brought clubwear and lounge clothes because he hadn't expected to do anything beyond work and relax, but he had one shirt and one pair of jeans stashed at the bottom of his suitcase. His just-in-case pair of clothes had come in handy this time. He shucked out of his clothes with his back turned to Antonio, leaving as much space between them as possible too. His stubborn cock slapped his belly as he changed from his lounge pants to a pair of jeans. Blaize put on his shirt before regarding Antonio again. Ready? The photographer flashed a smile. Good. A samba place is not far from here, and it's a beautiful spring night. Would you like to walk with me? I already agreed to the date. You don't have to keep asking me things. Antonio merely smiled. I want to make sure you're accepting of my plans. He led Blaize down the elevator and out of the building, turning left on the sidewalk before taking Blaize's hand in his and leading him down the street. On the way from the hotel, they passed a collection of slender models mingling with not-so-slender designers. They paused their conversations as Antonio guided Blaize past them. The models' faces puckered while the designers bypassed Antonio and studied Blaize, whose cheeks warmed under their discerning eyes. I told you that you should be one of our models, Antonio leaned into Blaize, whispering against the shell of his ear. And I told you I'm no model, Blaize reminded him. I don't even know the first thing about modeling. My camera tells a different story. Your camera has you holding it. You're a master photographer, so it's not fair to judge. I am not a master photographer. I was just inspired by you. Photographs come out better when there is a connection between the model and the photographer. Oh, so you're so confident you can say there's a connection between us? An electric one. Are you going to deny it? Blaize shook his head. Tell me more about samba. Antonio grinned. There is not much to tell. It can be danced in groups, pairs, or solo, and it is a very versatile dance. Okay. It's not just salsa? Antonio chuckled. Not hardly. They are nothing alike. Salsa requires pairs and is very strict when it comes to steps and counts. Samba is much more freeing. Oh? Well, I've never danced either one, so I guess it doesn't matter much. By the end of the night, you will be an excellent samba dancer. I am a good teacher. Well, I'm glad you have that kind of confidence. Blaize rolled his eyes even as a chuckle escaped his lips. Antonio was charming. The rest of the walk to the club went in silence. Antonio happily looked around, and Blaize happily watched him. This place is beautiful. I wish I had my camera with me. That's something only an artist would say. I definitely don't wish I was at work right now. I don't wish you were at work, either. I am glad you decided not to go. Sure, but you kind of overreacted. I mean, okay, you're from Brazil, so you may not know this, but gay clubs in the States get threats all the time. Antonio frowned. I take threats seriously. If I took every bomb threat seriously, I would have missed plenty of work weekends already this year. I mean, I'm sure they're serious somewhere, but they just haven't been at the clubs yet. Because they haven't been isn't a reason to ignore the threat. Why don't the police get involved? Blaize chuckled. The police don't care, especially since it happens all the time. And also, especially since it's a place they would never go. If it were a straight club, things would be different. I see. The color drained from his face as Blaize continued talking. Are you okay? Yes? You don't really look okay. You look a bit pale. Seriously, are you okay? Yes. I had a memory. Antonio squeezed Blaize's hand. A memory about what? About something that happened before I was the famous fashion photographer I am now. Blaize's features went through several emotions. First he frowned, then his features distorted in a smile. Then he shook his head. Are you really famous? Really? Antonio chuckled. I am incredibly famous. You clearly don't read fashion magazines, do you? I clearly don't. But seriously, tell me what happened. Antonio pressed his lips together, and Blaize studied his stoic profile. His gaze was thousands of miles away as they closed the distance between themselves and the club. The upbeat music touched Blaize's ears and improved Antonio's mood. I will tell you, but after we dance. You promise? Antonio smiled, cupping Blaize's cheek. I promise. Then he led Blaize the rest of the way to the dance floor. Dancing with a pole behind you was one thing. Samba was another. Even though they ran through the first steps slowly, Blaize didn't catch on right away. He tripped over Antonio's feet, got turned around with the steps, and struggled to stay on the beat of the music. When the music paused for a break, Blaize rubbed his hands down his face. This is a bit mortifying. I'm really a good dancer. Antonio kept a hold of Blaize's hand. The dancing had slicked down the tiny hairs framing his hairline and gave him a nice glistening sweat. His shirt clung to his body, highlighting every muscle on him. You were great. I really wasn't, but okay. Wait here. I will get us something to drink. Okay. Antonio squeezed Blaize's hand before letting it go and weeding through the crowd. He approached the bar counter and spoke to the tender. Then Blaize looked around. The dance floor was packed with couples, mostly straight ones, who already knew the steps and continued practicing them through the break. They weren't beginners. The photographer returned with 2 glasses of water with no ice. One glass was only half full, and Antonio finished it off as he handed Blaize his glass. Thanks. Blaize nursed it. I believe we have another 10 minutes before the music starts again. Blaize nodded. She announced it. So now it's my turn to ask questions. Blaize sipped from his glass. Sure, but I'm not guaranteeing you any answers. Of course. I only have one. What made you become a dancer? Blaize's easy expression dropped. Okay. If you're asking because you think I have some daddy complex, I don't. It's nothing like trying to substitute random dudes for the love I never got from my father. The money is good and quick, I do well, and there's no reason to stop right now. Antonio smiled. That's not what I asked. I asked why you started, not why are you still doing it now. Blaize took another gulp of his water, before rolling his eyes up to Antonio's face. His heart constricted when he met Antonio's kind, understanding gaze. There was no judgment or assumptions hidden in it. Just curiosity. Interest. Kindness. He hadn't told anyone why he started dancing, but most people never asked. Johns were happy to get any story that allowed them to feel better about themselves, and the other dancers had their own horror stories, so they knew not to ask as well, but Antonio had never gotten such a message. He didn't know the unspoken rules, and he didn't care about them, either. Blaize sucked in a breath. "Because I needed to leave a bad relationship," he murmured. "This was the only way I could." He shook his head. Long-buried emotions bubbled from deep inside of him, and his hands trembled. The water sloshed out of the high sides of the glass, and the glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the dance floor. The sound was deafening, and Blaize squeezed his eyes shut, bracing himself for a physical reprimand. Sparks of pain prematurely stung his skin, but instead of a slap or a kick or a punch, Antonio yanked his trembling body close. "Hey. It's okay," he whispered, fingers combing through Blaize's short hair, lips brushing against his temple. Relief flooded through Blaize, and every muscle in his body went slack. He melted into Antonio, and Antonio accepted it, rubbing a hand down his back while combing through his hair again. "You're okay," he repeated. They moved from the middle of the dance floor to the outside, Blaize hobbling along with Antonio, while the other man supported the majority of his weight. He felt stupid and foolish crying about an ex-boyfriend on a date with someone else, but once the floodgates had been opened, he couldn't close them again. He gripped Antonio's shirt and buried his face as silent tears striped his cheeks. It wasn't supposed to be like this. And they still had 2 more days to go. Chapter 6. Antonio. The night of dancing ended with one simple question that had a complicated answer, but he didn't regret holding Blaize for hours. By the time the man pulled his head out of Antonio's shirt, his wide-spaced eyes were puffy from crying, and his smooth skin was blotchy as well. Antonio stroked his cheeks with his thumb. "Better?" Blaize shook his head. "No, but I have to be." He swiped his cheeks, sucking in a ragged breath, and slowly putting his mask back on. "You can let someone take care of you, you know." Antonio cradled his face, swiping his thumb over his lush pink lips. "Is that person supposed to be you?" His words were sharp, but he didn't have his usual confidence to make them bite. "It can be if you want it to be." It was a diplomatic answer, a safe answer, a stupid answer, because the truth was, Antonio had been invested ever since he stepped into the hotel room and met Blaize's eyes. "Do you want it to be?" Blaize lifted his head away from Antonio's idle touch, dismissing him with a turn of his head. "I'm not going to be someone's situationship or summer hookup. This is none of those things." "Really?" His fire came back, and he snapped his attention to Antonio again. "You're going to drop your famous model photographer life for a relationship then? Going to turn down all the kitty girls seeking out a warm lap?" "For you, yes." "Why? You really don't even know me." "How long does someone have to know someone to know they're the right person?" "I don't know, but probably more than 24 hours at least. Wouldn't you think so?" Antonio shrugged. "I suppose I used to think so until I met you." "Rich? That's good." Blaize's eye twitched and he folded his arms, turning his back to Antonio this time. "I'm not ready to go back to our hotel. Would you like to continue walking through the city with me?" "I sure." Antonio smiled and took Blaize's hand, threading their fingers together as he led him from the dance club to the sidewalk. It was on the midnight cusp of a new day, but the bustling city had barely slowed down. The constant lights and movement was overwhelming for Antonio, and took him on a deep dive into his own hard memories. "Would you like to know why I didn't want you at the club tonight?" Blaize dragged his eyes from the street to Antonio, tipping his head back on his shoulders. "Because you're paranoid?" "Yes, that. However, do you want to know why?" Blaize nodded. "Yeah." Antonio nodded as well. "My country is beautiful. We have samba, amazing food, wonderful culture, but we live in fear. It is the way of life there. Citizens are controlled by it." He squeezed Blaize's hand. "Bombings aren't an unusual occurrence. I have stood as a witness." Antonio's eyes hooded, drooping closed as the screams filled his ears, and the smell of chemicals, blood, and death assaulted his nose. Blaize rubbed his shoulder. Antonio cracked his eyes open, flashing a weak smile towards the other man. The images faded, but the stench in his nostrils lingered, tainting the air around them and keeping Antonio rooted in his memories. I cannot describe the horrors I saw that day. My coworkers all perished. The crew. The reporter next to me. I was lucky. I left unharmed. His nostrils flared. I captured it with my camera. I wanted to show the world what we went through, the things we experienced. Oh, Anton, Blaize started, gripping the other man's shirt. I'm so sorry. You did nothing, but now you know why I couldn't let you go there. Even if it was fake. Antonio stroked the meat of Blaize's thumb. Blaize chewed his bottom lip. I never really thanked you for your concern. Oh no, you surely didn't. Antonio laughed. Okay, so. Thank you. Blaize squeezed his hand and stopped walking, jerking Antonio back as well. The photographer turned a confused gaze towards him, quirking one thick eyebrow. You are welcome. Blaize nodded. Good. His fingers wiggled in Antonio's hand, loosening the tight grip he had and sliding them over the other man's palm. The touch stopped Antonio in his tracks, sending thrills down his spine and a rush of blood to his cock. He stepped closer to him, closing the spare distance between them. When he inhaled, their chests touched. Their breathing synced. His cock strained against his jeans, the hard ridge pressed against the seam, begging for freedom, but he ignored it. His need was strong, but Blaize set the pace, and their pace was achingly slow. Antonio had no shortage of beautiful people surrounding him, but not a single one of them made his heart race like the little Spitfire in front of him. Blaize kept him on his toes. He was witty and sexy, and he was only centimeters away from Antonio. Their breaths kissed first, and Antonio's cock kicked in his jeans. His muscles tightened, jumping under the thin film of his shirt. He caught the mint and pine scent off Blaize's skin, and his eyelids fluttered. Blaize, he whispered. One word was all he could force around the knot in his throat, the constricted tension in his entire body. It was a light question, then their eyes met. The same hunger raged through him, and he tipped his chin up. Kiss me. Antonio's heart stuttered. Yes, he choked and yanked Blaize into him with one hand while the other came to the back of his neck. His fingers teased the fine hairs before fisting them and pressing his lips into Blaize's. Rough. Desperate. Blaize tasted just as good as he looked and smelled. His lips were sweet like peppermint, and the caverns of his mouth dripped with honey. Antonio trapped Blaize in the kiss, letting his desire take over. He fisted the other man's hair, kissing and nibbling and sucking Blaize's plump lips, until they were pink flushed with blood, until Blaize's body responded, until the other man's hips were smashed into him. The hard line of Blaize's cock taunted him, and they created heat through desperate friction. His balls ached and beads of pre-cum worked through him, wetting his briefs. Then he yanked himself away, shuddering. Room. Now, he demanded. Yeah. Blaize agreed. Chapter 7. Blaize. They stumbled through the lobby, fervent for each other, keen, hungry, and sought refuge in the elevator, where Antonio pressed Blaize into the back wall, lacing their fingers together and sliding their palms over Blaize's head. He trapped him there and found his lips for another raw, impassioned kiss. Blaize's insides scrambled. He had never been kissed with such intention, such force. Antonio was sure and confident about both his desires and his needs, and it flowed through him each time their lips met, each time he tasted a heady mix of tobacco and cinnamon. The elevator dinged as the doors closed, and it traveled up to their floor, twisting Blaize's stomach in knots even more so than Antonio already had. When the elevator opened again, Antonio released him. Panting breaths lifted his shoulders, and his nostrils flared as his hazel eyes fixed on Blaize. The desire glowed in them. Are you sure you want this? Antonio's husky voice asked. What? Blaize shuddered. His cock thrummed as his eyes scanned over the other man's hard bronze body. The question caught him off guard, and his brain fought through a haze of excitement to supply him with an answer. Yeah, he exhaled finally. I've never. Antonio kissed him again, but this time it was softer, and he cupped Blaize's cheek as he did. If there's anything you don't want, you can tell me to stop. He whispered on Blaize's lips, feeding him those accented words, breathing life into him. Then they exited the elevator, hand in hand, and Blaize felt almost virginal again. Nerves tickled his stomach, and sparks fired at every nerve ending. He was so excited, painfully excited, but he didn't know the steps to this dance. Antonio slipped the keycard into the door and let it swing open, guiding Blaize into the room first before kicking the door closed and placing the keycard on the side table. Still yes? Antonio smiled. Genuine. Kind. Blaize sucked his bottom lip. Yes? Antonio grabbed the hems of his shirt and ripped it over his head, muscles flexing at the gesture. His abs rippled, and his dark nipples were headlights on his chest. When his shirt fell, his swollen muscles relaxed, and he offered Blaize an unobstructed view of his torso. I thought artists were supposed to be skinny and starving, Blaize quipped, voice shaking as he spoke. His voice betrayed his excitement and his nerves, quivering over words that were foreign on his lips. It hadn't been what he wanted to say. He wanted to remark on Antonio's raw beauty. He wanted Antonio's beaded nipples in his mouth. He wanted his lips against Antonio's rock-hard abs. Antonio chuckled. I suppose you were wrong then. His muscles clenched under Blaize's exploring gaze, and he closed the shallow bit of distance between them, thumbing the hems of Blaize's shirt next. Can I take your shirt off? Blaize sucked in a breath, bracing himself on the side table with one hand. Antonio's spare touch was dizzying, and the reality of what was happening was overwhelming. Blaize's body was ready, beyond so. His cock wept in his jeans, begging for Antonio's attention. Why yes. Antonio nodded, fisted Blaize's shirt, and peeled it over the other man's head, sliding his hands over his skin in the process. When he tossed the shirt aside, a rumble escaped his throat, and he moved his hands back down Blaize's body, thumbs touching his nipples while his other 4 fingers held him in place, denting his sides. He stared, then he bent himself for a kiss. He swept his lips along Blaize's high cheekbones, hot breath tickling his skin. Blaize shivered and tipped his head back, capturing Antonio's lips. They were barely half-dressed, but Blaize already felt an orgasm creeping down his spine, twisting inside him. It wasn't just this session or Antonio's lips against his. It was everything. The photo shoot, the compliments. He knew Antonio wanted him, craved him. The photographer hadn't made either of those facts a secret. Blaize could see the leashed desires in the man's eyes with each further question he asked. He could feel it in the force of the kiss and in the way Antonio held him close. Can I suck your nipples? Antonio breathed against his lips. The question was bold, full up with confidence and desire, but Blaize flushed. The warmth swirled over him, burning his cheeks. Oh God, he whispered, yes. His cock throbbed again, aching in his jeans and eager to make its presence known. Antonio nodded and ripped his lips away from Blaize's. With a sigh, he released some of his pent-up desires and dotted kisses along Blaize's prominent collarbone, inching down to his nipples and covering every bit of skin between them. Blaize's heart pounded and his knees turned to jello. At first he watched, knitting his eyebrows at Antonio's infuriatingly slow pace, but as soon as Antonio's lips connected with his hardened nipples, he dropped his head back on his shoulders and let his eyes roll back in his skull. His legs trembled, and he gripped the side table as deep rumbling moans escaped his throat. Oh God, he groaned, eyes closing as he arched his chest for Antonio, surrendering to his expert tongue and soft plush lips. He was on fire. His whole body tingled, but his nipples and the space between his legs burned. His sack ached, trapped in his jeans with his pulsing cock. Antonio enjoyed one nipple before switching to the other, administering the same treatment to the second one. He didn't cut corners, and he didn't rush, even as Blaize gripped his shoulder and urged him faster. Antonio kept his slow, maddening pace as he abandoned Blaize's nipples and dotted kisses like Morse code down his lean belly, whispering Portuguese words against his smooth skin. Blaize couldn't speak Portuguese, but he didn't need a translator for the words tumbling from Antonio's mouth. He knew the man was singing his praises and begging for more of him at the same time. The photographer teased the waistband of Blaize's jeans with his fingers and then his lips. Please, he said in plain English, crouching in front of Blaize and flicking his eyes up to him. Their eyes locked on each other, and Blaize's belly hollowed. Precum worked through his cock, wetting the head and gluing it to the fabric of his briefs. His cock needed to be freed, and Antonio's teasing gaze wasn't helping Blaize's plight. Before Blaize worked an answer from his throat, Antonio focused on his manhood, nuzzling against the outline of his cock. Kissing it. Yeah, Blaize moaned, fingers sliding through Antonio's curls, pushing them away from his face and drinking in the sight of his furrowed eyebrows, flushed cheeks and swollen plump lips. The bed. Antonio nodded. Of course. With a quick kiss, he stood again and guided Blaize to the bed, laying him down over it and crawling on top of him. Blaize let himself be guided, and he sank into the plush comforter, letting it mold to the curves of his body. He rested his hands on Antonio's bare shoulders, sliding them over corded muscles and hooking them behind his neck. This was better. Antonio smiled and kissed him. I'm going to suck your cock, he promised, skating one hand along Blaize's lean torso and cupping his face. His thumb touched Blaize's lips before his own lips took his thumb's place. The photographer started down Blaize's body again, kiss after kiss until he reached the crotch of his jeans for a second time. He unhooked the top button of Blaize's jeans, inched the zipper down with his teeth, and fished him out of his briefs with a hungry growl. Blaize's cock sprang free, and cool air met blazing skin only for a moment before Antonio had the flat of his tongue against the underside of Blaize's cock. More deep groans exploded from him. Antonio, Blaize groaned as his tongue traveled from the base of his cock to the head, swirling around it, cleaning him of sticky pre-cum even as more flowed for him. He cleaned that too, with a growl of his own. You taste heavenly. Thanks, Blaize whispered between groans. As soon as he adjusted to the man's tongue against him, Antonio took him into the caverns of his mouth, sealing his lips around his shaft and taking more of him, inch by inch, until his nose pressed against Blaize's body. His throat worked around him, constricting and stretching. Blaize rolled his hips, covering his face with his forearm. Ah fuck, he whimpered. Antonio yanked away, leaving him exposed to the elements and coated with a thick layer of saliva and pre-cum mixed together, but he wasn't neglected for long. Antonio's strong hand wrapped around him. He fisted him, coaxing his orgasm through him, urging him closer to a release, and then he combined his amazing hands with his mouth, sending Blaize to another planet. He bit the meat of his middle finger as Antonio worked him over. His skilled mouth and his rough hand moved together, providing every inch of skin with pleasure. Blaize had never had a blowjob so thorough. He'd never had a man enjoy it as much as Antonio enjoyed it. He'd never had a man crave his cock, so much so that saliva leaked from his shining lips and he barely stopped for a breath. The pleasure was unmeasurable, but watching Antonio give it to him was better. His eyes stayed glued to Antonio, and each time his cock disappeared into the other man's mouth, he came closer to his orgasm, until he was teetering on the edge, until the head of his cock swelled, growing and shrinking with his racing heartbeat. Every muscle in his body twitched. And then Antonio retreated. His cock slid from Antonio's mouth with a wet pop, and he groaned, almost tumbling over the edge right then. Blaize panted, rolling his shoulders as he gathered his breath and studied the ceiling, before looking towards Antonio. Don't stop, he whispered, hips arching forward, ass lifting off the bed and towards Antonio's mouth. The photographer chuckled, letting Blaize's cock brush over his lips, but he didn't reward him with more oral attention. Instead, he wrapped rough fingers around him, palming the head of Blaize's cock as he let his own spring free. Antonio's cock fought its way out, and while he had seen the man's length trapped in his pants, it was different seeing it in the flesh. The man's cock was a solid 9 inches of bronze, pulsing beauty, and a blush rose on Blaize's cheeks as he stared at it. His ass clenched with anticipation, and his attention went from Antonio's gorgeous cock to his face. Ask? A deep chuckle emanated from Antonio. Ask for what, he teased, resting his cock against Blaize's thigh and kissing his tight torso. Ask to taste you again? Ask to have your orgasm on my tongue. Blaize shuddered. No. He shook his head. Do you want me? The question was shy. Somehow, despite having a wonderful night and an almost perfect man on top of him, somehow, the same fears crawled from the back of his mind, poisoning everything Antonio had done so far. What ifs plagued him, questioning Antonio's easy smile and warm gaze. So much, Antonio responded, free from hesitation. I feel ridiculous wanting you as much as I do. He accented his words with a kiss to the ball of Blaize's shoulder, and he walked his lips inward until they were against the column of Blaize's neck, and continued steadily upward to his jawline and then his lips. I want you. How? Blaize's heart darted around in his chest, bruising his ribcage. Like this. I want to kiss you at the same time. He closed his eyes. Now his heart turned over. Yeah, he uttered his approval in a soft voice, spreading his legs as one of Antonio's exploring hands dipped between his thighs. It strolled along sensitive skin until it met his center, and Antonio's fingers touched his hole. The spare touch sent shockwaves through Blaize, and his cock responded with a flow of precum. It dribbled down his length, settling warm on his aching balls. Another bead followed the same trail as one teasing finger circled Blaize's hole, pushing past the first ring of nerves and then retreating. Blaize moaned, opening his legs for Antonio. There's probably lube and stuff in the drawer. Antonio continued his teasing after a simple nod. His fingers continued teasing, dipping into Blaize and sending waves of pleasure through him. Blaize's eyes rolled back, and he found himself clinging to Antonio as he continued his maddening touch. His cock jerked and kicked, making more precum than he'd ever seen himself make. His balls burned, tight against him and aching for a release. He could barely focus on anything besides the patient way Antonio was enjoying his body. When he thought he was done for, when he knew he couldn't take another second of the man's tease, he heard the familiar rip of a condom wrapper, and he felt Antonio's cock blunt against his hole. He gasped and groaned as Antonio slid into him, stretching and filling him like no other man had before. The delicious fullness spread over him, and he moaned as Antonio captured his lips and moved against him. Their rhythm started slowly at first, but Antonio's pace accelerated, and Blaize's body rolled to meet Antonio's. He slid his cock along the photographer's hard abdominals, and Antonio fisted the sheets over his shoulders as his thick cock hit every sensitive spot inside of him. Blaize closed his eyes and saw stars behind his eyelids. He opened his eyes again and saw the other man's hazel eyes fixed on his own. See close. Come for me. Let me feel you tight around me. Please. Antonio's voice dropped to a growl, and he whispered those rough words into Blaize's ear. You want to feel me come? Blaize responded, turning his head to Antonio, pressing sweaty cheek into sweaty cheek. Antonio nodded, giving him permission to release his orgasm. It only took a handful of thrusts before Blaize's body arched again. He pressed his sweaty chest into Antonio as his ass tightened around his cock. Blaize held off his climax until he couldn't anymore, and it ripped through him. His wound-too-tight muscles seized as jets of steamy cum shot from the head of his cock. I'm coming, Blaize gasped through a haze of pleasure. The orgasm had already started, but it had also rendered him speechless for those initial bursts of pleasure. He clenched his teeth as pulse after pulse of cum came from him. Oh fuck. I'm coming. Antonio thrust into him, but his smooth rhythm faltered, and he exhaled deep moans. His muscles jumped under a sheen of sweat, and his lips went slack as his eyebrows furrowed in the center of his forehead. Me too, he gasped, raspy words tickling the shell of Blaize's ear. He held him close after his orgasm, panting as they both came down, and Antonio slipped out of him. The larger man didn't move away, though. Instead, he kissed Blaize's shoulders. I'll get a towel, Antonio rumbled as Blaize's cum went from sticky and hot to watery and cold. In a minute, Blaize whimpered, pulling Antonio into him. He had never felt so completely satisfied and taken care of, and he wasn't ready for that feeling to end. Chapter 8. Blaize. The morning after the best sex of his life, Blaize rolled over in bed and peered at the sleeping man beside him. He'd vowed to take a solid break from dating, vowed not to fall into another situationship with the next most ineligible bachelor that looked his way. He wanted to believe Antonio was different, he did, but his past told him differently. Antonio was a lot of things, but different and better than other men might have been a stretch. He snored like other men anyway, and his magnificent cock managed to fight its way out of his briefs and greet the morning air like other men too. Blaize's mouth watered for it. His whole body was ready for an encore of the previous night, but his mind knew better, and his mind was firmly in the driver's seat. Thank God. Blaize slipped out of bed and disappeared into the bathroom, reluctantly washing the feel of Antonio's hands off his skin with the sweat and cum from the other night. The lavender scent of generic hotel soap replaced the hitty scent of Antonio's cologne, and the rough coils of a shower sponge replaced his soft touch. When Blaize turned the water off, he stepped out of the shower, wrapping a towel around his hips and patting his face dry as he heard a knock at the door. "Can you get that?" he called, but Antonio groaned from the bed, and he stepped into the bedroom to see the man throw the fluffy white comforter over his body and turn away from the knocking. Blaize shook his head and padded to the door, swinging it open. "How can I?" he started, but his words cut off as three leggy women pranced into the suite. "We're looking for Antonio. Is he here?" The last woman to enter flicked a discerning gaze towards Blaize, while the other two strolled through the suite. "His stuff is here." A short-haired brunette announced. "I bet he's still sleeping." And then she darted to the bedroom. "You shouldn't be," Blaize started again, scowling as the other two women joined the brunette, repeating Antonio's name like a glitching record. They relaxed all around him, before peeling the fluffy comforter away from his face. "Ah, I bet I know how to wake him up," the curviest of the three announced, a devilish glitter in her eyes. Blaize stared wide-eyed as they discarded the comforter and trailed manicured hands over Antonio's hard body, ending with three pairs of hands desperate for a grip around his massive cock. "Good Lord. This is my room too," Blaize hissed. "I am awake," Antonio groaned. His cock, no doubt already hard before they pulled the sheets away, only grew harder as the women teased and giggled. What man wouldn't want to be woken up by three gorgeous models fawning over his manhood, after all? Scowling, Blaize grabbed a shirt, a pair of pants, and fit his feet in a pair of shoes before he stormed out of the room, letting the shirt cling to his still moist back. Clutching his cell phone and keycard in hand, he descended the elevator and stepped off on the first floor. The hotel had woken up for the morning, so no matter where he turned, there was a sea of shaven legs attached to perfectly proportioned torsos. They filled the elevator, occupied all of the seats by the enclosed pool, and picked over the light, complimentary breakfast, complaining quietly about the soft scrambled eggs and the overcooked grits while grabbing a muffin and banana instead. Blaize seethed, gritting his teeth as he weeded through the crowd and out of the establishment, shoving his hands in his pocket as he picked a random direction and started walking. The walking escalated into a run, and he eventually found himself in front of his favorite breakfast place. It was 5 miles from the hotel, and his dancer friends often shared a Saturday breakfast at the place if they weren't too tired from the night before. Satsuma, the sign read, and an orange circle with a green leaf served as a logo. The place was packed, but as he walked in, his ears recognized the familiar voices and laughter of his friends. "Can I help you, sir?" A server greeted Blaize, clutching a menu in her hands and looking him up and down. "Yeah, I'm meeting some friends," he motioned to a table full of fresh-faced dancers, men and women alike, who already had a round of drinks set in front of them. "Well, okay." With a skeptical gaze, the server nodded and walked him towards the group. "Blaize," one of the men called, wiggling manicured fingers towards him. Bedroom curls framed his heart-shaped face, and the previous night's mascara had given him a smoky eye. "Hey Evan," Blaize smirked. The server added a chair as everyone else murmured pleasant greetings to Blaize, stopping their individual conversations only briefly as he squeezed in beside Evan. "Didn't expect to see you here today." "Yeah, I don't think I was expecting to be here," he confessed, relaxing into his chair with a sigh. "You missed an awesome night last night. But I mean, maybe it wouldn't have been so awesome if you'd been there. The whole place was popping. I made so much cash. On second thought, maybe you should take more nights off," he giggled, lifting a mimosa to his lips. "It's not even noon yet, and you're halfway through with that. The best cure for a hangover is to drink." Evan rolled his eyes. "Besides, I haven't slept anyway, so it's not really like I'm starting fresh." "It's 9 o'clock, Blaize blinked. "Oh, I know. The girls and I went out." "Went out to where?" Blaize scoffed. Just out. Is that code for spending the night with a John? Evan rolled his eyes and took another sip of his drink, crossing one leg over the other, and arching his hips, turning his whole body towards Blaize. So tell me what had you skipping out on work last night? Long story short, this guy I'm staying with freaked out because of the bomb threat. We get bomb threats all the time. I'm starting to believe they're good for business. Yeah, well, he didn't want me to go. Okay. Back up. So, Evan drawled, you suddenly have a man now, and he tells you where you can and can't go. No, Blaize frowned, and also no. That's how it sounded. You said staying with a man. I thought we agreed that this year was sexy, singles summer. We had agreed. We're still agreeing. I'm not dating this guy. Blaize sighed and squeezed his eyes shut. Okay. The deal is, the hotel I'm staying with got overbooked for the weekend, and they accidentally double-booked my room. So for the last 3 days, I've been sharing my luxurious hotel oasis with Antonio Silva. Ooh. He's Brazilian. What? How do you even know that? Silva is the most common last name in Brazil. Everyone's last name is Silva. Anyway, so he's hot? Blaize groaned. He's not bad, but he comes with a gaggle of women who just will not go away. So right now, he's probably getting a killer blowjob from 3 models. Oh. So if it's your room too, then tell them to go away. Evan shrugged. It doesn't work like that. No, sweetheart, that's exactly how it works. Call security. Kick them hoes out. Get back on daddy's cock. Blaize grunted. Give me a sip of that. He snatched Evan's drink from him, lifting it to his lips and taking a huge swallow. The alcohol burned his throat and settled like a rock in his belly, churning his empty stomach. Evan giggled. Point still stands. He chewed his bottom lip for a moment. So, do you like him? Am I really that transparent? Yes. Yes, you really are. We had sex last night. Evan jerked his head back. That's not a euphemism for anything else, is it? Had sex still applies to the act of being naked next to someone, right? That's what we're talking about. Oh my God. Yes, Evan. Yes. I had sex with him. With no clothes on. And he is impressively good at it. Okay, there are different levels of good. There's understands the mechanics of sex good, there's I'm broken but I know how to throw down good, and there's I'm honest and sweet and romantic good. We went dancing too. Samba? Blaize squeezed his eyes shut. Yes, he hissed, samba. Sexy Brazilian samba dancing guy. Okay, if you're breaking your streak, he sounds worth it so far. A round of food came, and the server replaced Evan's mostly drank mimosa with another one, pairing it with a glass of water as well. The food delivered was a spread, and Blaize pinched off a few grapes, juggling them in his hand after passing one across his lips. Yeah. I don't know. The sex was, Blaize chewed his bottom lip, amazing. It was amazing. And he's honest and open, and it's nice. So go back to your hotel, kick them bitches out, and take your man back. No. I don't want to fight with people for his attention. He's a photographer, and he's always going to be traveling and be around women who have no regard for anyone's personal space and think they own the whole planet. Also, we've only known each other for 2 days. Okay, well, I can't say much on the first part, but on the last part, well, okay. You'll just be one of those old couples that says they knew from the second they met the other person, yada yada. Where's the manual that says you need to wait 3 months before knowing you like someone? How's that been working out for you? It hasn't. Thank you for the reminder. No problem. You should give this guy an honest chance. No, thank you, actually. I think I'm going to pass. Blaize ate another grape. Anyway, what are your plans for the rest of the day? Finish breakfast, sleep, drag myself to the club tonight. You'll be there? Absolutely. I will absolutely be there, Blaize confirmed, popping another grape past his lips. Chapter 9. Antonio. 6 months ago, hell, 4 days ago, he would have loved waking up to 3 women fisting his cock. This morning, however, it was the last thing he wanted. And Blaize's soft voice as he left broke him. The other man already plagued his thoughts, but now it was different. The trio of women attempting to give him the best hand job of his life were ruining what he hoped was the start of a new relationship. After 5 minutes of their futile treatment, Antonio sat up and moved their hands away with an apology. His cock softened, and he found himself apologizing for that too. It took him another 20 minutes to usher the women out of the hotel room and close the door, and another 10 minutes of coaxing to weasel Blaize's cell phone number out of the front desk associate. Then he called Blaize, pressing his cell phone to his ear and pacing the room with one hand on his hip. "No," Blaize answered on the 3rd ring. "No?" "Yeah. Whatever it is you had on your tongue to say, an apology or a defense or whatever, I'm not interested in hearing it." Antonio sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I did, indeed, have an apology ready for you." "Well, I don't really want to hear it." "Can I say something else then?" Blaize was silent on the other end of the cell phone, his breathing soft. Tamed. "Well? Sure, whatever. I had a wonderful time with you last night. I would enjoy doing it again sometime." "Which part?" "What do you mean?" "I mean," Blaize hissed, "which part do you want to do again? The part where we talk to each other, or the part where you stick your dick inside me and get your rocks off?" "You are angry." "No fucking shit, Sherlock. I did not invite them in. I never even heard them knock. I know you didn't because I did, and I thought it was something important, so I answered. You didn't tell them to leave. They barged in before I could. You didn't tell them to leave either. They're gone now." "And it's been how long?" Blaize snapped. "You know, I always seem to fall into it with players. Is it me? Am I just not good enough?" "You are beyond good enough." "Am I?" "Because you weren't pushing them away this morning." "Blaize. I was half asleep. Please. You know what? I really just don't think I can do this. I'm not ready." Blaize sighed. "I thought I was, but actually I'm not, so." "Blaize. Don't. You have photo shoots today, right?" "Yes." "What time?" "Most of the afternoon." "Cool. I'll text you when I'm in the room and when I leave." "You don't have to do that." "No, actually I do because I don't want to see you. At all." "Blaize." The line went dead, and Antonio worked his jaws, tucking his cell phone in his pocket. He glanced at the bedside alarm clock with a sigh and started getting ready for his day. He packed his work bag full of supplies, checked his chargers and his memory devices, and stashed away his laptop. The shoot for the afternoon featured the 3 women he had politely declined that morning, and he clenched his jaws as they breezed past him in thong bikinis and triangle tops, massaging their own nipples until the points dented the delicate fabric. The first girl, a curvy brunette with tan skin and bright blue eyes, stepped in front of him, crossing her legs at the knees and combing manicured fingers through her locks. "Should I lotion up? What were you thinking for the shot?" The bikini bottoms were tight on her hips, and she tugged one higher, resting it above the swell of her ass and showing a peek of her shaved core and pale, hidden skin. "If you would like. It won't affect the shoot," Antonio rumbled, keeping his focus on his camera. "Do you have a moment to help? I can't reach my back. Have one of the other models help you. I'm busy getting set up." He set his jaws and moved away from the woman, directing a lighting crew and taking initial test shots. When the first model slithered onto the set, he sighed and lifted his camera to his face again, peering at her through the lens. The lighting was perfect, bright and shaded. The sunlight glowed behind her, giving her an ethereal aura. He knew the shots would please the designers, the magazines, and even the models, but he took no joy in the work. His mind wandered away as he worked, performing his job on autopilot. He pressed the shutter as the model moved in slow, fluid increments, writhing like a bitch in heat for his camera. She fixed her gaze on the lens, meeting his eyes and licking her lips. He captured it, zooming in until he could see the freckles dotting her nose and the devious sparkle in her eyes. Her attempts to excite him were futile. The other two models tried and failed at the same task. They picked different spots along the set to work, floating from the poolside chair to strolling around the pool, using the setting as props. They dipped themselves in the water and re-emerged like blossoming butterflies, casting beads of water into the sky. He preserved the images with his lens, but it was all bittersweet when Blaize texted him 2 short messages, throwing him deeper into his somber mood. When the photo shoot ended, he disassembled his camera and tucked it back in its carrying case, shouldering the bag as the models flitted away, wrapping their scantily clad bodies in fluffy hotel-issued robes. "Hey, Antonio. Everyone's going out to AW Fins. We reserved a room for drinks, food, and relaxing." A plump designer caught up with him, touching his shoulder as he spoke. "Ah. Hey." Antonio slowed, turning around and facing the designer and peering down at him. "AW Fins? Yeah, it's a premier seafood place on the beach. We all pitched in and reserved a room for everyone. Plus, all the drinks are on us. All you have to do is bring your talented self." Antonio smiled. "Thank you for the offer, but I was planning to have a quiet evening back in my hotel room. The one you share with that guy." His smile tightened. "Blaize, yes. But he's working tonight." "Oh, you want to enjoy the room to yourself for a bit?" The man's brow wiggled. "Yeah, definitely. I was going to begin editing the raw photos." "Really? Editing photos on a Saturday night?" The man wrinkled the bridge of his freckled nose. "Come out with us. I promise you'll have a good time." Antonio sucked his teeth, rolling his eyes around the area. He reluctantly turned his attention back to the designer. "Fine. I'll join you. What time?" "Reservation starts in about an hour, but you can arrive whenever you want." "Of course," Antonio murmured. "I suppose I'll see you there." "Awesome." The man clapped Antonio's shoulder. "Then I'll see you round." "Yes," Antonio murmured, turning back around and jogging up to the room. He prayed that he would run into Blaize when he opened the door. Just the anticipation of it, the possibility, sent his heart thundering. He wrapped his fingers around the door handle as he slipped the keycard in the slot. When he pushed the door open, his face fell. Blaize, of course, wasn't there, and he cursed himself for his own excitement. He had worked himself up to excitement, just to suffer an unnecessary disappointment. He grit his teeth as he looked around the room. Everything was perfect. There was barely a sign of Blaize's belongings in the space, and Antonio's heart ached. He set his camera down and floated around the room, changing out of his casual work clothes into a button-down shirt and tailored slacks. He studied his cell phone, reviewing the 2 messages Blaize sent him before he tucked the device away, nestling it in his back pocket next to the keycard. He hopped into a taxicab, sliding in beside 2 slender models and a stocky little limp-haired designer wearing a heavy scarf. The trio was already engaged in conversation, with the 2 models fawning over the designer. Giggles filled the taxicab, and Antonio pressed his lips into a thin line as he closed the vehicle door and leaned back in his seat. He went unnoticed for the beginning of the drive, but when the women finally noticed him, they smiled. "Antonio Silva, right?" The designer spoke first, resting a pale hand on Antonio's arm. "Yes. I'm sorry, I don't remember your name." "Gracie Plum." A shy smile touched her face. "I saw a few of your test shots of my bathing suit cover-ups, and they were amazing. I can't wait to see the finished photos. I'm sure they'll be better than I can truly imagine. It's not my photos that make your products look nice. It's your work. And the models, of course." Antonio recovered some of his bad mood, tipping his head to the models as they giggled. "I'm sorry," one model chimed in, a Russian accent heavy on her words. "I never got to shoot with you. My name is Lada." She extended her hand, and Antonio shook it. "There's still one more day. Perhaps we'll both get lucky tomorrow." The casual words flowed past his lips, even as his heart shrank deeper into his chest. Each word out of his mouth hurt. It made him ache for Blaize, but he didn't want to drag his company down with him. He faked his smile and skillfully carried the conversation until they reached the restaurant. Then he helped all three women out of the vehicle and led them inside. By the time they entered the private room, Lotta had attached her lithe body to his side, and her bee-stung lips found his stubbled jawline more than a few times. She sat beside him, resting her hand on his thigh and sliding down to his knee, before starting up towards the center of his body. As she explored, two servers split the table and accepted drink orders. Lotta's fingers gripped Antonio's growing cock as the female server stopped beside him. "Can I get your drink order?" she asked, tone droll. "A Royce on the rocks, please," he replied in a husky voice as Lotta closed what little distance they had between them, hiding her teasing with one slender leg over his lap. Chapter 10. Blaize. Blaize wasted time at Lamppost Coffee until it was time for work. He sat down at a booth in the back, ordered a mug of tea, and played on his cell phone, ignoring the world around him as his mind drifted to Antonio. Antonio, the sexy Brazilian photographer who had probably managed to crawl under 5 women by now. Him. And yet Blaize had second thoughts. Perhaps he had fought Antonio too much. Perhaps he should go a little easier on the man. After all, it wasn't Antonio's fault that Blaize answered the door. His tea went cold, and his cell phone battery dinged an angry warning before he finally sighed and hitched a ride with a friend to the club. He changed in the back room, sandwiched between a host of new dancers and a few veteran dancers. "I thought you weren't coming tonight. I heard on the wind that you're seeing someone." A man squeezed in beside Blaize, dropping his bag on the bench next to him. They were almost twins, save for the curling scar starting at the other man's hip, and the eternal sadness hidden in his eyes. "Hey, Adam." Was the wind Evan? Because if so, he's wrong. And if it wasn't Evan? Adam smiled after he peeled his shirt over his head. An understated ring decorated his finger and sparkled in the room's yellow light. "Well, they'd be lying too, because I'm not seeing anyone." Adam chuckled. "You don't have to deny it. It's okay to see someone, you know. It's been how long?" "Not nearly long enough. How about you focus on your own man, instead of worry about my lack of one?" "Easy. My man and I are going strong." Adam hinted at the ring. "You're not going to take that off when you dance?" "Not at all. If someone has an issue with my ring, they can kiss my ass. Or they can pay me to take it off." With a lopsided grin and a slight shrug, Adam finished his preparations and left Blaize in the locker room. Blaize ripped his shirt over his head and adjusted the crotch of his G-string before surveying himself in the mirror. He looked good, maybe actually good enough to be someone's muse, whatever that meant. He studied places on his body that, at one point, had so much dark and purpling bruising that he never expected to heal completely. Now his skin was clean, clear, and there wasn't a single trace of the physical horrors his body endured. He rubbed his hands down his face, shook his hands, and then left the locker room and entered the main body of the bustling nightclub. He paused by the door, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light before he started his rounds, walking a well-traveled path through the club. He surveyed potential clients, took note of the men giving him second and third glances, and eventually posted himself beside his closest friend, Evan. "Didn't think you would make it tonight," Evan teased, strumming manicured nails against the wall and lifting heavy, smoky eyes to his friend. Yeah. I already heard from Adam." Yep. "How's it been so far tonight?" Evan shrugged. "It's a Saturday. Everyone'll probably leave with a couple grand. It's been busy, but it'll be some work. Mostly new people interested in seeing what a club is all about. I haven't seen any regulars." Blaize made a face. "So we're earning our money tonight, you mean?" "Oh yeah." Evan snapped his fingers. "You're dancing after Felix." Evan motioned to a red-headed dancer currently raking in money from an enraptured crowd. Between the cascade of ginger curls and the piercing green eyes, he had every patron around his table waving bills at him. He made his way gracefully, adding a feminine flair to his movements and allowing each person, man or woman, a chance to slip a bill in his G-string. He giggled each time one touched his smooth pink skin. He thinks he's so damn cute, Evan grumbled. Blaize laughed. It's because he is. Look, he's safe sex. You're a naughty sex vixen. It's two drastically different markets. Look at him, raking in all that money. Hum. Except while he gets money on the stage, you get more privately. I guess, Evan murmured as Felix's dance ended. Don't get pouty. You're great at what you do, and besides, green isn't your color. Blaize grinned, touching his friend's side before slipping off, preparing himself for the stage. Tiptoed feet entered the stage when a heavy rock song started playing, and the DJ announced his entrance. He loved the song, and as his fingers wrapped around the stripper pole in the center of the stage, he let the music flow through him. He let it take over, and he lost himself in it. Worries and concerns and anger melted away, and it was just him, the music, and his body. While some of the other dancers focused more on the people gathered around the stage, Blaize focused on enjoying himself. He still ended up in a bed of single-dollar bills, but he also ended up winded with a little sheen of sweat and heaving muscles. The men around him whistled as the song finally ended, and he crouched, collecting the bills from the stage. Can I get a lap dance? One patron asked, and Blaize glanced up with a smile. Sure. I'll come find you after I dance on the other stage. Blaize motioned to the stage Felix had moved to. The man was also collecting money, but he had earned himself a bucket at this point, and a bouncer was helpfully dumping money in the container with him. Cool. Should I pay now or? Blaize smiled. I'll be back. Then he wrapped his earnings around his G-string and secured it with a rubber band, sliding off the stage next to the curious patron. He brushed his hip against the man's shoulder and approached the other stage, hoisting himself up. For his second dance, he focused more on working the crowd than he did on showing off his movements. He played, flirted, and pried dollar after dollar out of the men around him. He lost count, but at the end of the next song his G-string was stuffed full of money, and the feel of fingers on his skin had energized him. Something about those slight brushes excited Blaize. None of the men would ever have him, and he liked it that way. He slipped off the stage again, dumping his earnings into a metal bucket once the bouncer delivered one to him. The bouncer carried it to the locker room for him, too. Thanks, Joe, he murmured. No problem. Looks like a good night out there, the stoic man replied. It's not bad. Blaize smiled. Stay on it. More people, more problems, right? Pretty much. I already booted a guy out of here for whipping his dick out at one of the stages. Joe grunted. Let me know if you need anything else. Sure. Blaize tugged his lips in a little smile as the man strolled back out of the locker room. Then he turned back to his money, counting it and stashing the majority of it away. He tucked it in the bottom of his duffel bag, under a pair of sweats and old sneakers, then he grabbed his cell phone and a towel out of the bag. He checked his cell phone, replying to a few messages and scrolling social media as he ran the towel over his sweaty skin, patting himself dry. He ran the towel between his legs, wiping collected sweat from the creases of his thighs and around his waistline. As he tucked the towel away again, his cell phone buzzed on the bench, and Blaize glanced down at it. It was the photographer. Antonio. Blaize sucked his teeth, rolled his eyes, and picked up his cell phone, answering the call and putting the device to his ear. What do you want? Blaize. You. I want you. The photographer's sultry voice filled the receiver, and Blaize set his jaw, eyelashes fluttering as he processed Antonio's response. We've really already been over this. I just really don't think it's a good idea. Okay. The other day was a fluke, and we can pretend it never happened, go back to our regular lives and be happy. Ah. There is the problem. What? Blaize frowned, zipping his duffel bag closed with the cell phone resting in the crook of his shoulder. I cannot pretend it never happened. I cannot go back to my regular life, and if I could, I wouldn't be happy. You're being dramatic. Am I? You'll find someone else. You're a photographer, and you work with beautiful models all the time. You'll find someone else. I don't want anyone else, Blaize. I want you. Antonio, Blaize started, sucking in a deep breath. His heart turned over in his chest, somersaulting around and making him lightheaded. He believed him. Every word. But he couldn't do it. Another relationship. Another man. His body woke up for Antonio, and he felt his touch all over him, but his mind reminded him of the dangers. Antonio's soft touch couldn't soothe the memory of aches and pains deep in his muscles and bones. What is it? I really don't think I can do this with you, Blaize ground out. I need a reason, because last night you were with me. We were together, and there were no second thoughts. I apologized for the women. What else? Blaize fell silent, squeezing his eyes together and pinching the bridge of his nose. Tears welled in the corners of his eyes, stinging them. I'm at work right now. We can talk about it later. Blaize paced the length of the locker room. Antonio. There's nothing to. Before he finished his sentence, the cell phone flew out of his hands and into the concrete wall behind him. In the next instant, Blaize joined his cell phone against the wall. Strong hands slammed him into the wall, and his head hit the concrete with a heavy thump. The pain spread through him, throbbing through his brain. His eyes crossed. Wah! He gasped before one of those strong hands gripped his jaw and fixed his face forward. I told you that you could run from me, but you could never hide, the voice dripped with anger. Blaize recognized it, and as much as Antonio had buoyed his heart, it now fell to the ground. His stomach went with it, and fear crept through him. You don't know how much I've missed you. He pressed his lips hard against Blaize's in a bruising, rough kiss. His facial hair scratched Blaize's smooth skin. You were pure when I had you. Fancy finding out you've been a glorified whore for the past few years. Blaize's features distorted. His eyebrows knit together, and his lips curved in a frown. I'm not, he gasped. Blaize? Antonio called from the abandoned cell phone. Blaize, are you okay? What's happening? The man sneered, releasing Blaize's jawline with a shove and a punch. A warning. He picked up the cell phone and put it to his ear. And who are you? He groused. What business do you have with my man? Blaize trembled against the wall as he heard Antonio's murmured reply. He couldn't make out the words, but it didn't matter. Whatever Antonio was saying had his ex-boyfriend's features delving deeper into anger until he finally jerked the cell phone away from his ear, dropped it on the ground, and crushed it under his boot. Security is going to catch you, Blaize warned. The man's gaze darkened, and a sick smile spread over his face. They won't because I already paid them off. It's time for me to recover what's mine, and make sure it never runs away again. He grabbed Blaize by the neck, thumb nestling itself right under Blaize's jawline, and he lifted the smaller man a few inches off the ground. Chapter 11. Antonio. Security is going to catch. And the cell phone line went completely dead, cut off abruptly. Antonio called back, but the number went directly to voicemail. He didn't like the sound of whoever Blaize was with. The man's tone was malicious, his questions invasive, and Blaize's response had been concerning. Every worst-case scenario rushed through Antonio's mind as he jumped up from the hotel room couch, threw on a shirt, a pair of jeans, and a pair of shoes, and exited the room. Shoving his keys, wallet, and cell phone into his pocket, he dashed down the stairs and stopped at the front lobby. Can I help you, sir? A man lazily dragged his eyes from his computer screen. Yes. I need to know the location of the local LGBT gentlemen's club. Oh? You mean the Cockpit? Yes? The front desk worker relayed the address, and after a speedy ride in a taxicab, Antonio jumped out of the vehicle and stormed into the club. The ride had given his anger time to grow, and his adrenaline time to spread through him. By the time he fought his way inside, his anger was bubbling over as he stormed through the establishment, bouncers close on his trail. His eyes scanned the room, resting on the faces of various dancers, who all regarded him with a certain interest until they stopped on a man who could have been Blaize's twin. There were differences. Their eyes weren't the same, nor their lips. Not quite. The photographer had spent a photo shoot and a night memorizing everything about Blaize's body. He could paint a picture of him while blindfolded, but for now, Antonio stormed up to his look-alike, rolling his shoulders back. "Hey," the dancer responded, casually at first until he studied Antonio's hardened features. "Where's Blaize?" The man looked around, probably locker room. He was just on the stage, so he motioned to a back room past the two brightly lit stages and cluttered bar. "Thanks." Antonio stormed past him and went to the locker room. "No patrons past this point, sir." A bouncer his same height stepped from the shadows and blocked the door. "Someone is in there getting hurt," Antonio snarled. "That may be the case. If so, they can call for help, but patrons aren't allowed past this point." A little smirk touched the bouncer's face, and it was just enough to set Antonio off. His hand balled into a fist, and he sent his fist flying into the bouncer's face, connecting with his jawline. It cracked under the pressure, and the impact spread through Antonio's hand and arm. His knuckles popped too, but it released some of the adrenaline welling inside of him. He moved the bouncer aside and shoved the locker room door open, and then he saw red. Antonio crossed the room in seconds and hurled a man's body off Blaize's naked one, throwing him into the wall with every ounce of strength inside him, and then flying at him again. He let his anger control him, and he gripped the stranger's shirt, holding him in place as he drove punch after punch into him. He destroyed his jaw, blood leaked from a broken nose, and by the time he was finished, the man's eyes darkened where two black eyes were forming. The man's lips swelled, and a blubbering plea finally escaped his throat. Antonio growled and slammed him into the wall again, lifting him off the ground and leaning forward. They were chest to chest, nose to nose, and Antonio's eyes narrowed. "You ever touch him again, and it'll be the last thing you do in your life," he snarled, before discarding the other man and turning around. His anger dissolved when his eyes found Blaize, and they roamed over his naked body with a soft rumble. Bruises were already forming against his skin, marks from where he had been bent over and from the stranger's rough touch. "I'll get dressed," Blaize croaked in an eerily flat tone. His voice was raw from the bruising on his neck. "You're going to the Antonio rumbled. They had garnered a crowd now, and a slender man approached Blaize, grabbing him in a hug. "Oh my God. Honey, are you okay?" He worked quickly, shielding Blaize's nakedness from the rest of the crowd and regarding Antonio with a sour expression. "Give me your shirt." "What?" "Now," the man insisted, and Antonio growled before complying, dragging his shirt over his head and handing it to him. He pulled it over Blaize's head, and it covered most of his body, leaving a peak of his cock and the crease of his ass exposed, but it was better than nothing. "Evan, it's okay," Blaize repeated, touching his friend's arm. "It's not. He had no business here, and those bouncers should be fired and arrested for aiding in a crime." Evan looked at Antonio. "Well? Do something." "I'm going to call an ambulance." "No," Evan hissed. "Come over there and make him feel better." "I'll call the ambulance." While Evan shooed patrons and dancers out of the locker room, Antonio approached Blaize, sucking in a deep breath as he looked the smaller man over. Most of his adrenaline had evaporated, but he was still alert, prepared, and at a loss for words. He pulled Blaize's trembling body close to him, hugging him around the shoulders with one arm and across his back with the other. "You're okay." Blaize shuddered at the touch before he surrendered to it. "What happened?" He shook his head. Antonio pet over his short hair, kissing his temple. "We'll talk about it later," he promised as the wail of the ambulance cut off any further conversation. They rode in the back together, and the workers checked Blaize's vitals and recorded his account of what happened while Antonio seethed. A rape kit was ordered. They sat at the hospital for 6 hours with nurses coming in and out. "More questions?" Blaize shivered. Antonio rubbed his hands over his face. Evan stopped by, delivering Blaize's duffel bag and casting Antonio a warning gaze. They took a taxi back to the hotel room early Sunday morning as dawn broke over the horizon. Blaize nestled into Antonio's side, and Antonio wrapped an arm around him. The drive was quiet. The walk through the deserted lobby was quiet. The elevator ride up to the room was quiet. Antonio dropped Blaize's duffel bag inside the door and sighed. Blaize wandered in behind Antonio, giving Antonio a wide berth as he shuffled by and sat on the corner of the bed, tucking his hands between his thighs. "Do you want to talk?" Antonio lifted his eyebrows, resting his hands on his hips. "No." "Let me rephrase. You need to talk." "There's nothing to say." Blaize looked away from him, staring out of the sliding balcony doors and clenching his jaws. "Who was he?" "No one." "Blaize. He's no one. Just forget about it." He wiped his cheeks where tears fell and shook his head, rocking his torso back and forth. "All right." Antonio resigned. "You should at least try to get a little sleep." Antonio motioned to the bed. With all his clothes still on, Blaize dutifully tugged at the covers, pulling them back. "Take your shoes off," Antonio suggested, voice calm. "Oh right," Blaize murmured, towing his shoes off before nestling himself under the sheets, collapsing into the pillow. His heavy eyes drooped closed, and after a few minutes, his breathing slowed, and his features relaxed into sleep. Antonio watched him, tugging his lips into a light smile before he changed clothes and grabbed folded blankets from the closet. He adjusted the cushions off the couch, setting them on the ground and carefully folding out the second bed. He moved slowly, but right as he settled the frame on the ground, Blaize stirred. "Antonio," he murmured, cracking his eyes open and peering at the other man. "Yes? Can I get you anything? Are you okay?" Antonio lifted his eyebrows, discarding the blankets and crossing the room, stopping at the side of the bed. "I am okay," Blaize chewed his bottom lip. "What are you doing?" His words were drunk and heavy with his exhaustion, and a hand reached out, grabbing Antonio's. "Preparing the couch bed." "Why?" Blaize mumbled. "Ah. Sleep here. Please." He swiped his hand over the empty space in the huge hotel bed. "Are you sure? You have been through a lot. I can take the couch. I want you here." Some of the exhaustion cleared from his voice, and he fixed a sobered gaze on the other man. "Please." Antonio sucked in a deep breath and held it. Blaize's gaze melted him. He was defiant, clear on his desires, but his eyes housed a mix of fear and desire as well. "I am not sure if it's a good idea. I want to feel safe, and I feel safe in your arms." Antonio closed his eyes. "All right." He eased into the bed behind Blaize. Chapter 12. Antonio. Daylight spilled into the room, and the hot sun beat against his back as he shielded Blaize from its latent torture. They had slept. Well, Blaize had slept. Antonio had drifted in and out of sleep, holding Blaize closer to him when he finally drifted off and returning to a respectable distance apart when he woke. He couldn't resist. He wanted the other man close, and if Blaize hadn't been so insistent on his presence, he would have finished the job he started last night. Remembering the sight of Blaize bent over, panic scarring his face sent red-hot anger through him, and he wanted to tear the man taking advantage of Blaize limb from limb. He would have. He still could. Antonio stroked Blaize's arm, kissed his shoulder, and rolled away from the other man, burying his toes in the soft rug and stretching his arms to the sky. "No," Blaize murmured, thrashing under the blankets. "Stop, please." His voice was a mumble, but the fear was evident. It was a plea, and Blaize squeezed his eyes tighter and recoiled from the invisible source of his despair. "Blaize," Antonio touched his shoulder, but he jerked away from his touch, sleeping features screwing into a pained frown. Blaize rocked the bed with his shudders. "No, please, no. Stop. I'll do whatever you want, please, Leon, please." The begging continued, escalating in severity, until tears streamed down blotchy cheeks. Blaize's eyes popped open, wide with fear, and he saw his enemy before his eyes for a few seconds before his troubled expression cleared and he breathed a sigh of relief. Antonio pressed his lips together, snatching a pair of sweats from the floor. He tugged them on one leg at a time and tied the drawstring closed before regarding Blaize. "His name is Leon?" Blaize rubbed his face, covering his eyes with his hands and nodding. "Yeah. Leon. And he hurt you?" Yeah. He is the reason why you started dancing. Why, yeah. He is why this room is so important to you. Why, yes, his voice was weak. It had the strength of the thinnest thread, and it threatened to break with each word. Blaize sat upright in the bed, tugging the rustled blankets into his lap, and tucking his hands between his thighs. He shrank in front of Antonio, studying the entire room before focusing on the photographer again. I left years ago, and crashed here for weeks when I was recovering, before I could get my life together again. I didn't think he'd be able to find me. I've been careful. Antonio shook his head. Where there is a will, there is a way. I guess so. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to bring this. This is why I thought. His voice dissolved into quiet sobs, and tears streamed down his face. He was vulnerable, and the most beautiful Antonio had ever seen him. The sunlight brightened his skin, and the moisture of his tears and the wetness in his eyes sparkled like gems. Treasured and priceless ones. Don't be sorry. Evan said the police arrested him, on charges of assault. Antonio cupped Blaize's cheek, stroking soft skin with his thumb, wiping the tears from his blotchy face. Blaize nodded. Thank you, he whispered. For coming to help me. Blaize's eyes hooded, and he kissed Antonio's thumb. I'll always come to help you. Always. Antonio smiled. As long as you want me to, I will. He stroked his cheek again as emotions surged through him. His heart hammered in his chest, and words he'd never said before rested on his tongue. He knew it was too soon. They barely knew each other, but every moment spent with Blaize was right. He knew it was right, and he didn't need to wait weeks to confirm something he already knew. What is it? Blaize whispered, flicking his eyes up to Antonio, searching his face. Nothing. His hand slid down Blaize's neck, massaging the base of his hairline. Let me make you something to eat. His hand fell away, and he put space between them, wandering into the kitchen and standing over a mostly empty counter. He turned a few leftover eggs and a handful of sliced vegetables into an omelet, and he added a half of a bagel and sliced apples before returning to Blaize's side, carrying his meal on a foam plate. It is the best I could do. It's great. Ah, thanks. He poked at the food, nibbling an apple piece and tasting the bagel, before regarding Antonio. If we were going to date, how would it work? Antonio sliced and ate his omelet first, then paused mid-bite into his bagel. He chewed and swallowed around an unexpected knot in his throat, and his eyebrows knit together. What do you mean? You travel all the time and I stay here. How would it work? Antonio tugged the corners of his lips down, biting into his bread again as he considered it. I'm a photographer. I don't have to work with high-end designers and top models. If it meant being with you, I would shoot weddings and baby portraits. Blaize nibbled another slice of the apple. Really? Yes. Absolutely. There was a quiet nod before Blaize discarded his plate and adjusted the sheets, smoothing them with trembling fingers. I want to. Antonio nodded. He finished his bagel, slid his hands down the side of his pants, and set his plate aside as well, turning his full attention to Blaize. Say that again. The other man's cheeks bloomed with color, and he tipped his chin down as a little laugh escaped him. You heard me the first time. I did, but I want to hear it again. Look at me this time and say what you just said. Blaize groaned softly, dropping his head back on his shoulders before squaring them and fixing his eyes on Antonio. I want to be with you. Antonio smiled, and that knot returned to his throat, cutting off his air as the same three words bubbled on his tongue. He knew it was too soon, but searching Blaize's dark eyes he was lost in them, and he never wanted to be found. I love you. What? Blaize blinked. It's two. Antonio shook his head. I don't need weeks and months to know I care for someone. These last few days have been the best days of my life. I can't imagine my life without you, and I don't want to. I love you because you are fiery, confident, proud. Blaize's flush didn't fade. It got deeper at each description of him, until he cut him off with a kiss. He mashed their lips together in a bruising connection, devouring him, and slowly slithering from the front of the bed into Antonio's lap. Blaize's fingers burrowed in Antonio's hair, and he trapped him there with a strong grip. The photographer's hands came to Blaize's sides, running up and down them and squeezing his hips. When the kiss broke, Antonio sucked in a deep breath. His cock strained against his sweats, pressing into Blaize's equally hard cock and his lean stomach. "What do you want?" Antonio rumbled. "Just you," Blaize murmured, "next to me." "Okay." He slid his hands over Blaize's body, before they settled around his torso, and he kissed Blaize's forehead. "I love you," he said again. The words sailed from his lips, riding on a satisfied sigh. Epilogue. 9 months later. Blaize thumbed through a stack of $100 bills, counting his earnings for the weekend before he finished packing his suitcase. Leaving the hotel room was bittersweet. He would be back in 2 weeks, but somehow, even after 9 months, the sheets still smelled like Antonio's musky pine cologne, and he enjoyed reliving the weekend they met over and over again. It was a movie he never got tired of re-watching. He secured the bills with a rubber band and tucked the wad in the pocket of his joggers, zipping his weekend duffel bag closed and throwing it over his shoulder. Once he settled in his vehicle, all he thought about was being back in his lover's arms. He ached for it, but it was the best ache. The welcome home sex never got old, and he never got tired of Antonio's playful smile either. As soon as he peeled out of the hotel's parking lot, his cell phone buzzed, and he dug it out of his pocket, answering on the second ring. "Hello? My love, are you on the road yet?" Antonio's voice filled the speakers as the cell phone automatically connected to the car's Bluetooth. "I am. I just left the hotel. I should be home in about 2 hours. Ah, I miss you." Blaize chuckled. "You say that when I go to the grocery store." "Well, it's not a lie." "Huh. What have you been up to all weekend?" "The wedding was yesterday, of course. I saved a slice of wedding cake for you. It is delicious." The number of weddings you shoot and my waistline aren't getting along. I'm going to have to start going to the gym more consistently." "There are many ways to burn off extra calories," Antonio rumbled, voice shifting from relaxed to playfully hungry. "You're right. Running, jogging, biking, lifting weights even?" "Not those ways." Then I don't know any more ways." "You do. This way requires few clothes, perhaps a bed," Antonio trailed. "Oh. You meant having sex. Is that what you meant?" "I assure you I can help you get rid of the calories you've added from the cake. I would be happy to. It would in fact be an honor." "I'll think about it. Or I could just have one bite of cake and that's it." "And that is no fun," Antonio teased. "Maybe not, but then I wouldn't have to worry about any of it. I very much prefer my solution." "You would. Anything else happen?" Blaize lifted the edges of his voice. "Hopeful." "Ah yes. I heard from the realtor Friday." "And?" Blaize bounced in his seat. "And she gave me the keys to the place." "And you didn't call me?" Blaize cried, slapping the steering wheel with excitement. "It was late. I figured you were at work already." He grunted. "Fine. So next week we're spending the whole week moving in then." "Ah well. I did quite a bit of moving in already. I purchased the white leather couch you had been coveting, and the 2-door refrigerator you mentioned as well." "Already delivered." "Indeed." "Cool. Anything else?" "Some other things. You can see them when you get here." "Sure. That's fine. Do I need to get anything from the store for dinner?" "Ah, not at all. Come straight here, my love." Blaize smiled. "Okay, then I'll see you in a bit." He ended the call and resumed the boring drive, turning on the radio for company. In just about 2 hours he veered off the highway, cruised through the city, and turned into their new neighborhood. They had saved for months, living in a small apartment, taking as much work as possible, and cutting as much as they could out of their budget. With strong dedication and a shockingly high income, they quickly had enough for a down payment on a house. Finding a house was serendipitous and happened quicker than they had ever imagined. Blaize loved the house. It combined both of their styles, and he couldn't wait to start a new life with Antonio outside of their separate small apartments and inside their new home. When he turned into the driveway, his heart was in his throat, but he rolled his vehicle to a stop behind Antonio's, setting the parking brakes and killing the engine. He squeezed the steering wheel. He was home. He was home to the man he never expected to have, in a home he never expected to have either, and it was everything to him. His shoulders sagged, and he traced the steering wheel, relaxing into his seat as he reveled in his new life before finally dragging himself out of the vehicle and walking up the concrete steps to his place. Antonio already had the door open, and his broad shoulders filled the doorframe, touching both ends. "I saw you through the kitchen window." He smiled, greeting Blaize with a gentle kiss square on his mouth. "How was your weekend?" "Fine as always. It was busy, so I made a good bit of money." "How are your friends?" "They're fine." "Oh. Will you shoot Adam's wedding?" "It's in 2 months." "Also," Blaize sucked in a breath, "I already told him you would." Antonio chuckled. "Ah. I should be able to do it. I just need to check with my assistant photographer." "Okay, I'll let him know." Smiling, Blaize entered the house, stepping casual loafers onto mahogany hardwood floors. The midday light spilled into the room, brightening it without the need for overhead lights, and the open floor plan filled him with inspiration. "I really love this place." "I really love you." Antonio closed the door behind him, kissing his cheek. "Let me show you the other things I purchased for us." "Yeah," Blaize nodded. "Please. I'll be pissed if you really got those bamboo brown bowls, they clash with the floor." Antonio chuckled. "I didn't. I got something better." "The teal ones I wanted." "No, my love. Come this way." He took Blaize's hand and led him through the house. They circled the kitchen, walking into the living room, and then the breakfast nook that featured a side yard and sliding glass doors. Antonio opened them and whistled. "What are you doing?" Blaize knit his eyebrows, but then looked into the yard as a big-pawed puppy bounded through the grass. Drooping ears flapped as he ran, and wrinkles cushioned his stubby joints. "Oh my God. What is it?" "A puppy," Antonio chuckled. "Every home needs a dog, doesn't it?" "Does it?" Blaize squealed, covering his mouth as the little creature wiggled at his feet, sniffing and licking his shoes before looking up at him with a lolling tongue and bright, glistening eyes. "Yes," Antonio smiled. Blaize scooped the wiggling creature into his arms and kissed its black nose. "Oh my God, his little face and his little paws and his little teeth," Blaize cooed. The puppy lapped the air between them. "I love him," Blaize moaned. "I love you." He squeezed the puppy and turned to Antonio, pressing a kiss into his lips. "I love you too," Antonio responded. His hand found the back of Blaize's head, and he stole a second kiss.